My name is Erin. I am 33 years old, and I recently experienced the ultimate family betrayal. We were at a high-end Chicago steakhouse to celebrate my birthday. During the meal, my mother leaned over to my father and whispered that since everyone was distracted, they should have my brother go change the locks at my apartment. My brother quietly got up and left the table. An hour later, he came back looking completely pale and whispered that armed security guards were already there. He had no idea that he had just attempted to break into a high-rise building that I legally owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth and tried to take everything you had. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago meant that appearances were everything to my parents. My mother Susan and my father David spent their entire lives cultivating an image of wealth and perfection. Inside our home, however, the reality was cold and transactional. Everything was a competition, and I was always the loser. My older brother Jason was the golden child. At 35 years old, he was handsome, loud, and perfectly molded in the corporate image of my father. He could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, was the family disappointment. Or at least that was the narrative they relentlessly pushed. The evening of my 33rd birthday started exactly how every other family gathering started. We were seated at a large round table in a very exclusive downtown steakhouse. The chandeliers cast a warm glow over the white tablecloths, and the crystal glasses clinked with the sound of expensive wine. I had worn a simple black dress hoping for a quiet evening, but my family never missed an opportunity to make a spectacle. My sister-in-law, Melissa, sat next to Jason. She was pregnant with their first child, and she made sure everyone in the restaurant knew it. She rubbed her barely visible belly and smiled sweetly as the waiter poured sparkling water into her glass. I sat across from them, quietly eating my steak and listening to my father boast about his latest real estate ventures. He ran a corporate firm and loved to hear himself talk. When the dessert plates were cleared away, my mother stood up. She tapped her spoon against her wine glass to get the attention of our table and the surrounding guests. I braced myself. A birthday toast from Susan was never actually about the birthday person. "I would like to make a toast," my mother announced, her voice carrying across the elegant dining room. "Today we are gathered to celebrate Erin turning 33. But more importantly, we are celebrating the true future of this family. Jason and Melissa are expecting a baby boy, a new generation to carry on the family legacy." Jason beamed and raised his glass. Melissa giggled and leaned into his shoulder. I kept my face perfectly neutral. I took a slow sip of my wine and let the disrespect wash over me. It was my birthday dinner, but I had been reduced to a footnote in my own celebration. But my mother was not finished. She smoothed the front of her designer dress and looked directly at me. Her smile was sharp and practiced. "Since we are all here together, we have an important family decision to announce. Erin, as you know, you are just a single struggling bookkeeper. You do not have a family to support, and you do not have any real career prospects. Therefore, you really do not need that spacious downtown loft anymore." The table went completely silent. I set my wine glass down very carefully. I looked at my mother, waiting for the punchline. There was no punchline. "Jason and Melissa need the space for the nursery." My mother continued, speaking loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "They need a premium location in the city. You will be moving out by the end of the week. We have already arranged a small studio apartment for you in the suburbs. It is much more suited to your income level." I stared at her, feeling the familiar sting of humiliation. They were trying to evict me from my home on my birthday in front of a crowded restaurant. I had lived in that beautiful loft for 3 years. It was my sanctuary. But my parents still operated under the assumption that they controlled every aspect of my existence. I did not cry. I did not scream. Years of dealing with their toxic behavior had taught me that emotional reactions only gave them power. Instead, I calmly picked up my napkin and wiped the corner of my mouth. "I am not moving out of my loft," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "I like my home exactly the way it is." My father, David, scoffed loudly. He leaned back in his leather chair and crossed his arms. "Do not be ridiculous, Erin. You dropped out of your master's program 5 years ago. You are lucky we even let you live in a property the family trust co-signed. You should be grateful we are finding you a new place at all. Jason actually works for a living. He deserves a proper home for his growing family. The sheer audacity of his statement was staggering. 5 years ago, I had indeed left my graduate program, but the reasons behind that departure were a closely guarded family secret. A secret they were weaponizing against me right now. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my lack of a flashy public lifestyle meant I was failing. My mother leaned over to my father. Her voice was meant to be a whisper, but she made sure it carried across the table. Since everyone is distracted here, just have your son change the locks at her apartment right now. She will have no choice but to accept the new arrangement once she is locked out. I heard every single word. I watched as my father gave Jason a subtle nod. Jason wiped his mouth, tossed his napkin onto his plate, and stood up. He grabbed his expensive wool coat from the back of his chair. "Excuse me, ladies," he said, flashing a charming smile to the waitress walking by. "I have some urgent family business to attend to. I will be back before the check arrives." He walked out of the restaurant with the confident stride of a man who believed the world belonged to him. Melissa watched him go with adoration in her eyes. My parents turned their attention back to their wine, looking incredibly pleased with themselves. They had executed their plan perfectly, or so they thought. They expected me to beg. They expected me to throw a tantrum or run out of the restaurant in tears. They wanted a show, but I refused to give them one. I simply leaned back in my chair and flagged down the waiter to order another glass of expensive red wine. I checked my watch, noting the exact time Jason left our table. I knew the drive to my downtown building took 20 minutes. My phone vibrated heavily in my purse, but I ignored it. I remained perfectly and absolutely composed tonight. My mother stared at me from across the table, waiting for the breakdown. She wanted my voice to shake and my eyes to well up with tears. When neither of those things happened, her painted lips thinned into a hard line of absolute frustration. She hated when I did not play the part she had written for me. In her mind, I was supposed to be weak and dependent. "Are you listening to me, Erin?" my mother demanded. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "I just told you that you are moving out of your apartment, and you are sitting there staring at your wine glass. Have you lost touch with reality?" "I am fully aware of reality, Mom," I said. My tone was entirely conversational, as if we were discussing the weather, rather than my impending eviction. "I just find it interesting that you chose my birthday dinner to announce that you are taking away my home to give it to Jason." Melissa let out a soft sigh and placed her hand over her heart, playing the sympathetic sister-in-law. "Erin, please do not make this harder than it has to be," she murmured. "Jason and I feel terrible about displacing you, but you have to understand that a baby changes everything. We need a premium neighborhood. You are just one person. You do not need 2,000 square feet of prime real estate to yourself. It is just practical." My mother nodded vigorously. "Exactly," she said, slamming her hand down on the table. "You should be thanking us, Erin. We are doing you a massive favor by finding you a place in the suburbs. You cannot afford that loft on your own anyway. You are lucky the family trust agreed to co-sign your lease. If your father and I had not stepped in to guarantee that property, you would have been living in a shoebox 5 years ago." I let her words settle over the table. 5 years ago was the date my parents always used whenever they wanted to remind me of my supposed failure. I had been enrolled in a competitive forensic accounting master's program, earning top marks and preparing for an internship that could have launched my career. Then, unfamiliar loans appeared under my name. My credit collapsed, and my financial aid disappeared. I never learned who had submitted the applications. The bank treated me like the debtor, the university treated me like a liability, and my parents treated the disaster as proof that I could not manage adult life. I had been forced to leave school and rebuild from nothing, while they repeated a convenient story about pressure breaking me. They did not know I had spent 5 years preserving notices, signature pages, and account records connected to that ruin. "You threw your entire future away," my mother continued, her voice rising in pitch. The neighboring tables were listening now, but my mother never really cared about making a scene. "You quit your master's program because you were too lazy to put in the work. You spent the last 5 years bouncing around doing basic bookkeeping for pennies while your brother worked his way up the corporate ladder. Jason is a vice president now. He earned that loft. You are just occupying space. It was fascinating to watch her rewrite history right in front of me. She truly believed I was a failure because I did not wear designer clothes or drive a luxury car to family events. I deliberately kept my life private so they would not pry into my finances. My silence had allowed them to build a towering monument of false assumptions. I took another slow sip of my wine. The wine was exceptional, and I was determined to enjoy it. You know, Mom, I said, setting the glass down, I really admire your dedication to Jason. It is impressive how much you are willing to sacrifice for his comfort. I am not sacrificing anything, my mother snapped. I am making a sound family decision. You are 33 years old, and you have nothing to show for it. No husband, no children, no career trajectory. It is embarrassing, Erin. It really is. We are tired of pretending that your little bookkeeping hobby is a real job. We are tired of subsidizing your life. I turned my attention to my father. He had been sitting quietly swirling his bourbon and letting my mother do the heavy lifting. He always preferred to play the silent authority figure while she acted as the enforcer. Speaking of sound business decisions, Dad, I said, shifting my focus entirely. I read an interesting article the other day about the commercial real estate market in the city. It seems like a lot of the major corporate firms are facing a serious liquidity crisis right now. My father frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together. He clearly did not like the sudden change in topic. What are you talking about, Erin? The market downturn. I clarified, keeping my expression bright and inquisitive. I was just wondering how your firm is handling the current economic climate. A few of my bookkeeping clients mentioned that credit lines are drying up for commercial developers. They said some of the older legacy firms are over-leveraged and struggling to refinance their debt. I hope your company is not facing any of those liquidity issues. My father let out a harsh, barking laugh. He looked at me as if I were a child who had just tried to explain quantum physics to a scientist. He leaned forward and planted his elbows on the table, invading my personal space with his arrogant posture. That is exactly why you are moving to the suburbs, Erin, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. You read one article online and you suddenly think you understand macroeconomic trends. It is actually quite funny. You do not know the first thing about corporate real estate or structured finance. You manage balance sheets for local bakeries and dry cleaners. Do not try to sit at the adults' table and talk about things you cannot possibly comprehend. I tilted my head slightly, feigning innocent curiosity. So your firm is completely secure then? You are not worried about your primary creditors calling in your corporate loans? My father rolled his eyes and scoffed loudly. My firm is untouchable, he declared proudly. We have ironclad relationships with the biggest private wealth management institutions in the Midwest. We just secured a massive restructuring deal with a top-tier private equity firm that guarantees our operational liquidity. Real business is about leverage. You would not understand because you never had capital to maneuver. Melissa nodded in agreement. David is a genius, Erin, she chimed in. You should listen to him. I pressed my lips together to stop a smile from breaking through. My father was right about one thing. Real business was absolutely about leverage. What he did not know was that the private equity firm he had just praised was my firm. I was the anonymous founder and chief executive officer of the institution that held all of his debt. I owned his leverage. I literally owned the roof over his head. Well, I said, it sounds like you have everything completely under control, Dad. I am very glad to hear your creditors are so accommodating. My father waved his hand dismissively. Leave the real business worries to the adults, Erin. I nodded politely and took another bite of my meal, allowing a comfortable silence to settle over my side of the table. For the next hour, the dinner progressed exactly as they had planned it. My parents ordered another expensive bottle of wine to celebrate their supposed victory over my living situation. Melissa spent 20 minutes showing my mother photos of high-end nursery furniture, while my father lectured the waiter about the proper temperature for serving a medium-rare steak. They were so utterly relaxed in their arrogance. They genuinely believed they had put me in my place. I sat there eating my birthday dinner with a quiet sense of peace that I had never experienced in their presence before. In the past, an evening like this would have left me crying in the bathroom or rushing out to my car to avoid a panic attack. I would have spent weeks agonizing over how to please them or how to beg for their approval. Now I just watched them with mild amusement. It was like observing a group of people standing on a beach, admiring the view, completely unaware that a massive tidal wave was building just offshore. They were so busy congratulating themselves on their clever little eviction plan that they did not even bother to ask how I was supposedly handling the news. They just assumed I would quietly pack my bags and disappear into whatever suburban exile they had chosen for me. I ordered a slice of chocolate cake for dessert and savored every single bite of it. Just as the waiter was clearing our dessert plates, the heavy wooden doors of the private dining room swung open. Jason walked back into the restaurant, but all of his previous swagger had completely vanished. He was practically jogging toward our table, and his appearance was jarring. His expensive wool coat was thrown haphazardly over his arm, and his tie was yanked loose. He was sweating profusely despite the freezing Chicago wind outside. His face was entirely drained of color, making him look like he had just seen a ghost. Melissa smiled brightly as he approached, clearly expecting him to slide back into his seat and share a triumphant smile with my parents. Instead, Jason bypassed his pregnant wife entirely and leaned directly over my mother. His hands were shaking as he gripped the back of her chair. He tried to keep his voice low, but the sheer panic in his tone made his words audible to everyone sitting at our table. "Mom, someone is there," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "Armed private security guards. They are standing right outside the door and patrolling the lobby. They nearly arrested me the second I tried to touch the lock." My mother dropped her wine glass. It hit the table with a loud clatter, spilling dark red liquid across the pristine white linen. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice sharp and frantic. "What security guards?" Jason wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, looking around nervously. "I do not know," he hissed. "They were wearing tactical gear. They asked for my identification and told me I was trespassing on private corporate property. I had to run to the elevator before they called the police." My mother turned her horrified gaze toward my father. "David, what is going on?" she asked, her voice rising in pitch. "Did the family trust hire new security for the building without telling us? Why would they threaten to arrest our son?" My father looked equally confused. He pulled out his phone, his thick fingers tapping aggressively against the screen, as if he could magically summon the building manager to explain the situation. He muttered something under his breath about incompetent property management and threatened to have someone fired by morning. I decided it was time to put them out of their misery. I set down my fork and reached for my linen napkin. I dabbed the corners of my mouth with slow, deliberate precision. Then I folded the napkin and placed it neatly next to my plate. "Oh, you met my security detail," I said, keeping my voice bright and entirely conversational. "I should have warned you. They are highly trained professionals, and they take their perimeter protocols very seriously." The entire table froze. Jason stared at me, his mouth hanging slightly open. My mother clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "What did you just say?" she demanded. "Your security detail. What are you talking about, Erin? You do not have private security." I smiled warmly at her. "I do, actually. The family trust has not controlled that loft for 3 years. After my credit collapsed, I stopped allowing anyone else to hold the keys to my future. I purchased the unit through a proxy company, restored the title, and last month acquired the remaining apartments and commercial spaces in the building. The security team answers to my management company, not to Dad the Trust or Jason. So this is not a family property anymore, Mom. It is my building, and every entrance is now closely monitored." The blood completely drained from my mother's face. Melissa let out a small gasp and covered her mouth with her hands. "But I do want to thank you, Jason," I continued, turning my attention to my trembling brother. "Thank you for openly admitting to attempted breaking and entering in front of 20 witnesses in a crowded restaurant. That will make the police report incredibly easy to file if you ever try to go near my property again." The sheer silence that enveloped our table was deafening. Other patrons in the restaurant had stopped eating and were openly staring at our unfolding drama. My father slammed his phone face down on the table with enough force to crack the screen. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. His entire carefully constructed image of corporate superiority was shattering in front of a room full of high society peers. "You ungrateful little brat!" My father snarled, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. He leaned across the table, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. "You think you are so clever. You think playing these stupid games with proxy buyers makes you a real player in the business world. You are nothing, Erin. You run a measly accounting business that I could squash like a bug. I will destroy you by tomorrow morning. I will call every single contact I have in this city and make sure your pathetic little bookkeeping shop loses every client it has. You will be begging me for a job when I am finished with you." I did not flinch at his loud, aggressive threats. I did not even break eye contact with him. Instead, I slowly stood up from my chair and smoothed the front of my dress. I calmly reached into my designer purse and pulled out a $50 bill, gently placing it on the table to cover the tip for my glass of wine. I looked down at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. I simply smiled at him, feeling an overwhelming sense of ultimate satisfaction. He had absolutely no idea that he had just stepped perfectly into a massive trap I had been meticulously building for years. "See you tomorrow, Dad," I said softly, before turning and confidently walking away. The crisp morning air of downtown Chicago felt incredibly refreshing as I stepped out of my private car service the following day. I walked into the soaring glass atrium of the high-rise building that housed my actual workplace. The security guards at the front desk nodded respectfully as I bypassed the main elevators and swiped my personal keycard for the private executive lift. I rode the elevator up to the 52nd floor, watching the city's skyline unfold through the floor-to-ceiling glass. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning, and I felt an intense clarity about the day ahead. When the polished steel doors slid open, I stepped into the sprawling reception area of my firm. The walls were lined with dark mahogany, and the floors were pristine white marble. A massive brushed metal sign behind the reception desk displayed the name of the company I had built from the ground up over the past 5 years. We were a top-tier forensic accounting and private wealth management institution. We handled the financial architecture for some of the wealthiest families and largest corporate entities in the Midwest. My staff of 40 highly trained professionals was already buzzing with activity. Phones were ringing quietly, and financial analysts were walking between glass-walled conference rooms. This was my sanctuary. This was the empire I had created while my family thought I was sitting at a folding table doing taxes for local dry cleaners. "Good morning, Erin," my receptionist greeted me with a warm, professional smile as I walked past her desk. "Thomas is already waiting for you in your office. He said it was urgent." I thanked her and made my way down the executive corridor. Thomas was my lead corporate attorney and my most trusted ally. He had been with me since the very beginning, helping me navigate the complex legal structures required to buy back my own debt and launch my firm in total secrecy. He was a brilliant legal mind, with a perfectly tailored suit and a complete lack of patience for arrogant corporate bullies, which made him the perfect person to help me dismantle my father. I opened the heavy double doors to my corner office and found Thomas standing by the window looking down at the bustling city streets below. He held a sleek silver tablet in his hand, and his expression was completely grim. The natural morning light streaming through the windows did nothing to soften the serious lines on his face. "Good morning, Thomas," I said, setting my designer bag on my desk and taking a seat in my leather chair. "You are here early. I assume my father had a very busy night after I left the restaurant." Thomas turned around and let out a heavy sigh. He walked over and sat in one of the guest chairs across from my desk. "Busy is an understatement," he said, resting the tablet on his knee. "David spent the entire night calling every major commercial contact he has in the city. He tried to blacklist you. He told several property managers and small business owners that you were under investigation for fraud and that they needed to terminate their bookkeeping contracts with you immediately." I could not help but laugh. It was such a clumsy, pathetic move. He actually thought he could destroy my livelihood by making a few angry phone calls to people who did not even employ me. "He really has absolutely no idea what I do for a living, does he?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "None whatsoever," Thomas confirmed, shaking his head. The people he called were incredibly confused. Half of them did not even know who you were, and the other half just hung up on him because he was screaming. When he realized his little smear campaign was not working, he decided to pivot. He realized he could not touch your business because he could not find it. So he went after the only leverage he thought he still had. The amusement instantly drained from my body. I sat forward, resting my hands on the cool glass surface of my desk. What did he do, Thomas? I used his executive power to completely freeze the family trust, Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave. He filed an emergency injunction at 6 o'clock this morning, claiming there was suspected financial mismanagement within the trust accounts. Because he is the primary executor, the bank had no choice but to comply with a temporary freeze until a full audit can be conducted. He bypassed the usual board approval by claiming immediate risk of capital loss. I stared at Thomas, trying to process the magnitude of what he was telling me. The family trust was a massive entity that held various properties, investments, and liquid assets for the extended family. Freezing it was a nuclear option. It meant no one could access their quarterly dividends or manage scheduled property maintenance. But my mind immediately went to the one specific account that my father knew I monitored closely. "Aunt Carol," I whispered, feeling a sudden cold knot form in my stomach. Thomas nodded slowly. His eyes were full of sympathetic anger. "Yes," he said softly. "The freeze includes the dedicated medical fund set aside for your Aunt Carol. The bank has already halted all outgoing automatic payments. The $50,000 medical care allocation for this quarter was scheduled to be wired to her residential facility this afternoon. That wire has been canceled." My vision blurred for a fraction of a second as a wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over me. Aunt Carol was my father's older sister, and she was the only person in my entire extended family who had ever shown me genuine love and support. When I was a little girl, she was the one who remembered my favorite books and brought me art supplies when my parents refused to buy them. She had always been a quiet, gentle soul who never engaged in the toxic, competitive games my parents played. 5 years ago, she suffered a severe stroke that left her partially paralyzed and requiring full-time specialized care. She lived in an expensive residential medical facility outside the city. The family trust was legally obligated to cover her care. My father knew that I loved her. He knew I visited her every single Sunday without fail. He knew she was my only soft spot. He cut off her medical care just to get back at me, I asked, my voice trembling with a terrifying kind of calm. He is willing to let his own disabled sister face eviction from her medical facility just to punish me for not giving my apartment to Jason. Thomas tapped the screen of his tablet, bringing up a digital copy of the injunction filing. He listed the medical fund specifically in his addendum, Thomas explained. He claimed the facility costs were being inflated and needed immediate review. It is a completely fabricated excuse just to justify halting the payment. The residential facility will receive a notice of non-payment by tomorrow morning. If the $50,000 is not deposited within 48 hours, they have the legal right to begin transfer protocols to move her to a state-funded ward. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. I thought about Aunt Carol sitting in her wheelchair by the window in her quiet, comfortable room. I thought about the nurses who knew her routine and the specialized physical therapy she received every day. Moving her to a crowded, underfunded state facility would completely destroy her quality of life. The stress alone could kill her. My father was willing to sacrifice his own sister's health and safety just to teach me a lesson about obedience. It was a level of cruelty that even I had not anticipated. I thought this was just about a loft. I thought this was just about his fragile ego and his golden boy son. I had planned to dismantle his corporate empire slowly to let him feel the financial squeeze over months. But he had just crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. He had weaponized an innocent disabled woman to fight his battles. I opened my eyes and looked at Thomas. The last lingering shred of familial obligation I held in my heart had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, calculating determination that felt entirely foreign and absolutely right. "Thomas," I said, standing up from my desk, I need you to authorize a personal wire transfer of $50,000 from my private accounts directly to Aunt Carol's medical facility immediately. Do it under a confidential proxy name. I will not let her care be interrupted for a single second. Thomas nodded, typing rapidly on his tablet. Consider it done, Erin. The funds will be there before noon. What is our next move regarding David? I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out over the city. My father wanted to play games with leverage. He wanted to use money to starve out vulnerable people and force compliance. He was about to learn that he was outmatched, outfunded, and completely out of time. My father thinks he owns my life, Thomas. I said, my voice echoing softly against the glass. He thinks he can control me by hurting the people I love. It is time we show him exactly who holds his leash. Prepare the documents for the corporate debt restructuring. We are moving up the timeline today. Thomas smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that told me he was more than ready for the war ahead. I will have everything ready within the hour, he promised. I stood by the window and watched the morning traffic moving far below. The game had fundamentally changed. It was no longer just about defending my home or proving my success. It was about absolute systemic destruction. My father had chosen his weapon, and now he was going to drown in it. Thomas quietly exited my office, leaving me alone with the steady hum of city traffic far below my window. I walked back to my desk and sat down, letting the heavy leather chair absorb the tension radiating through my shoulders. It was barely 9 o'clock in the morning, and the battle lines were already drawn. I reached for my coffee mug, but before my fingers could even brush the ceramic handle, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the glass desktop. I looked down at the caller identification. It was Jason. The timing was almost comically predictable. My father had executed his malicious financial freeze at dawn, and now he had sent his golden boy to deliver the ransom demands. I let the phone vibrate a few more times. I wanted Jason to wait. I wanted him to feel that slight twinge of anxiety that comes when someone does not immediately answer to your authority. On the fifth ring, I calmly swiped my finger across the screen and pressed the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just waited. Well, 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 Jason crooned, his voice practically vibrating with arrogant satisfaction. How is the independent big city girl doing this morning? I hope you enjoyed your little performance at the restaurant last night, because the show is officially over. I leaned back in my chair and kept my breathing completely even. Good morning, Jason, I replied, my tone entirely devoid of emotion. I am actually having a very productive morning. What can I do for you? He let out a sharp, barking laugh that sounded exactly like our father. You can drop the tough girl act, Erin, he sneered. We already know you are panicking. Dad just starved out Aunt Carol's medical care. The family trust is completely frozen, and the bank has canceled the wire transfer for her residential facility. Sign the loft over to me, or Carol gets evicted from the care facility today. We own you, Erin. We always have. I remained perfectly silent, allowing his cruel ultimatum to hang in the air. He was so proud of himself. He truly believed that holding a disabled woman's health hostage was a brilliant tactical maneuver. He thought he possessed ultimate authority. You are actually proud of this? I asked, keeping my voice soft and inquisitive. You and Dad are using a vulnerable elderly woman as a pawn just to force me out of my home. It is not about being proud, Jason snapped, his tone turning defensive but vicious. It is about maintaining the natural order of this family. You stepped out of line last night. You tried to make us look foolish in front of Melissa and the restaurant staff. You honestly thought you could hide behind some anonymous proxy buyer and keep that loft for yourself. But Dad is a master at this game. He knows exactly how to squeeze people until they break. He will destroy anyone who disrespects us. I let out a slow, measured breath. He has been squeezing the family trust for years, has he not? I said, framing the statement as a casual observation rather than an accusation. I have seen the financial disclosures, Jason. The management fees that Dad extracts from the accounts belonging to our cousins. The mysterious administrative costs that magically drain the dividends meant for our grandparents' estate. You and Dad have been legally siphoning money from vulnerable family members for years to fund your lavish lifestyle. Jason did not even try to deny it. In fact, he sounded almost insulted that I would question their methods. It is called wealth management, Erin, he scoffed loudly. Dad built the corporate infrastructure that protects this family. He is entitled to compensation for his oversight. If he needs to reallocate funds from accounts that are just sitting there gathering dust to secure a better position for the active members of this family, then that is his absolute prerogative. I am his heir. I am the vice president of his firm. My child is the future of this bloodline. Aunt Carol is just a drain on our resources anyway. Putting her in a state facility is probably what we should have done years ago. The sheer callousness of his words sent a fresh wave of cold fury rushing through my veins. He truly viewed human beings as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. If you were not useful to their corporate image, you were entirely disposable. It was a disgusting mentality. So you think blackmailing me with her medical care is a legitimate business strategy? I asked, pressing him just a little further. You really believe that threatening her health is going to make me hand over a multi-million-dollar property to you without a fight? I know it will, Jason countered confidently. Because you are weak, Erin. You always have been. You care too much about people who do not matter, and Dad knows how to turn that weakness against you. You lost your graduate program, your apartment and your credit 5 years ago, and you still never fought back hard enough to make anyone fear you. That is why this works. The paperwork transferring the loft title is in your inbox. Print it, sign it, and have it delivered to my office by noon. If you refuse, I will call the residential facility and tell them the trust payment has been canceled indefinitely. I will make sure Aunt Carol is transferred before the end of the week, and you can spend the rest of your life knowing your stubbornness put her there. You have 3 hours to decide. I looked out the window at the sprawling Chicago skyline. The morning sun was reflecting brilliantly off the glass facades of the neighboring skyscrapers. Jason thought he was holding a royal flush. He thought he had trapped me in a corner where my only option was absolute surrender. He did not realize that I had already removed his leverage hours ago by wiring the money directly to her facility through a proxy account. You are making a very serious mistake, Jason, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. You and Dad have spent your entire lives operating under the assumption that you are the smartest people in every room. You think because you wear expensive suits and shout at people over the phone that you hold actual power. But you do not understand the first thing about real leverage or lasting consequences. Jason groaned loudly into the receiver. Save the dramatic monologue, Erin. Are you going to sign the papers, or do I need to make the phone call to the care facility right now? I am not signing anything, I replied flatly. And you are not going to make that phone call. Oh, really? Jason mocked. And who exactly is going to stop me from making it? I am, I said. Because you do not own me, Jason. You never did. You just convinced yourselves of a convenient lie because it made you feel superior. You can tell Dad that his little injunction at the bank was a cute trick, but it will not get him what he wants. My loft belongs to me. And as for Aunt Carol, you do not need to worry about her medical care anymore. What is that supposed to mean? Jason demanded. It means this conversation is over. Goodbye, Jason. I ended the call. Before Thomas could leave, his tablet chimed with confirmation from the facility administrator. He turned the screen toward me. The transfer had arrived, the quarterly account was fully funded, and scheduled therapy sessions remained in place. The administrator had suspended the transfer protocol David tried to trigger through the frozen trust. Aunt Carol would not be moved, questioned, or frightened by any of this. For the first time that morning, the pressure around my chest eased. I asked Thomas to establish a medical trust before the end of the day, funded from my private accounts, and protected from every member of my family. No executor controlled by David would ever touch her care again. Thomas nodded. Carol is safe, Erin, permanently. I looked at the phone in my hand. Jason still believed he was holding her future over my head. He had no idea the hostage had already been removed from the board. That certainty did not calm my anger. It sharpened it. Now I could strike without risking the only innocent person they had tried to place between us. I placed the phone face down on my glass desk and took a deep breath. The office was quiet, but my mind was racing with absolute clarity. I pressed the intercom button and asked Thomas to come back into my office. When he walked through the heavy wooden doors, I gave him the final instruction. I told him to initiate the total freeze on all of my father's corporate and personal credit lines immediately. I cited suspicious financial activity related to the sudden unauthorized injunction on the family trust. Thomas smiled a very sharp and knowing smile as he tapped the screen of his tablet. He informed me that the freeze would take effect across all connected banking institutions within the hour. By lunchtime today, my parents and my brother would not be able to buy a single hot cup of coffee without the transaction being loudly and automatically declined. At 3:12 that afternoon, Thomas forwarded a live security update from one of our banking partners. Jason and Melissa were inside a luxury dealership on North Rush Street, trying to purchase a $150,000 sports car. I opened the secure video link on my office monitor. Jason stood beneath the showroom lights with one hand resting on the silver roof of the car, as if he already owned it. Melissa was filming him with her phone, narrating a video for her friends about their early baby gift. A young salesman waited beside them with a tablet and a strained professional smile. The salesman tapped the screen, paused, and tried again. His smile weakened. "There appears to be a temporary authorization issue, Mr. Wilson," he said. "Would you like to use another card for the deposit?" Jason laughed loudly enough for everyone on the showroom floor to hear. "Temporary issue. Right. Run the black card again. The limit is higher than the price of this car." The salesman obeyed. A red notice appeared across the tablet. "Declined." Melissa lowered her phone. Jason's face tightened. He pulled a second card from his wallet and slapped it onto the glass desk. "Use the corporate account." The finance manager joined them, entered the information, and waited. Another red notice appeared. "Account restricted. Contact primary creditor." Several customers turned toward the sound of Jason's voice as he began arguing. "Do you have any idea who my father is?" he demanded. "David Wilson has financed half the commercial projects in this city. Call your regional director and fix this before I buy the car somewhere else." The manager kept his tone controlled. "Sir, this is not a dealership error. Your personal cards, your corporate line, and the pre-approved financing certificate have all been suspended. We cannot release the vehicle without verified funds." Melissa whispered that people were staring. Jason ignored her and called David on speakerphone. "Dad, they froze everything," he said. "Every card, even the company line." David's voice exploded through the phone. "That is impossible. Put the manager on." The manager declined to take the call. Jason then tried to authorize a wire from the family trust. The banking portal rejected his login and displayed the same restriction notice. His confidence vanished. He looked around the showroom and realized that every customer had witnessed the golden child discover he had no usable money. Melissa stopped recording and quietly stepped away from him. Jason grabbed the keys from the display pedestal, insisting that the signed purchase worksheet entitled him to leave with the car. Two dealership security officers moved between him and the exit. "Place the keys on the desk, Mr. Wilson," one of them said. "Then leave the property." Jason threw the keys hard enough that they skidded across the glass and fell onto the floor. He shouted that the dealership would regret humiliating him, but the threat sounded hollow. The security officers escorted him through the front doors, while Melissa followed several steps behind, covering her face from the phones now pointed in their direction. The video ended. I felt no triumph watching him fail, only confirmation that their power had always depended on borrowed access. Thomas called a moment later. "The freeze is holding across every connected institution," he said. "David has no accessible operating credit, and Jason has no personal liquidity. They will come after you tonight." I closed the video window and stood. My evening networking event at the country club began in less than 2 hours. If my family wanted another public confrontation, they knew exactly where to find me. I changed into a tailored black dress, gathered my files, and left the office at 5. My driver took me directly to the members-only club in downtown Chicago, where the city's most influential judges, investors, and wealth managers were already gathering beneath the chandeliers. I had been a respected platinum tier board member there for 2 years, but my parents were only standard members who barely managed to pay their annual dues on time. I walked slowly through the grand mahogany doors and politely handed my heavy winter coat to the waiting attendant. The main ballroom was bathed in warm, inviting light from the massive crystal chandeliers overhead. Waiters in perfectly crisp white uniforms circulated through the spacious room, carrying silver trays of champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. The warm air was filled with the low hum of sophisticated conversation and the soft, elegant melodies of a string quartet playing in the far corner. I greeted several familiar faces as I made my way toward the center of the room, feeling completely in my element. I was having a very pleasant conversation with a prominent federal judge and a local commercial real estate developer when the heavy brass doors of the ballroom suddenly burst open. The sheer violent force of the doors hitting the wall caused the string quartet to stop playing mid-measure. I turned my head quickly and saw my angry mother Susan storming directly into the room like a completely unhinged woman. My father David and my brother Jason were marching right behind her. They both looked entirely out of place and completely out of breath. My mother's hair was disheveled and her face was flushed a deep, angry red. She was wearing a cocktail dress that looked wildly inappropriate for a professional networking event. She scanned the crowded room with wild, frantic eyes until her gaze finally locked onto me. She did not politely make her way through the elegant crowd. She shoved past a group of elderly investors and marched directly toward where I was standing. The entire massive ballroom went completely dead silent. You could almost hear a tiny pin drop as the city's most powerful business people stopped all of their private conversations to stare openly at the ridiculous spectacle unfolding right in front of them. My mother stopped a few feet away from me, panting heavily, as if she had just run a marathon. "You vindictive little thief!" My mother screamed, her voice echoing harshly off the vaulted ceilings. "How dare you show your face in a place like this after what you just did to your own family?" I kept my posture perfectly straight and my facial expression completely neutral as I looked calmly at her. I did not raise my voice or take a step back from her highly aggressive stance. I just looked at her with mild curiosity. "What are you talking about, Mom?" I asked softly. She threw her hands in the air and let out a hysterical, theatrical laugh. "Do not play dumb with me, Erin," she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger directly at my chest. "You committed serious wire fraud. You hacked into your father's corporate accounts and you stole Jason's money. You froze all of our credit cards because you are a jealous, unstable spinster who cannot stand to see her brother happy." My father stepped up beside her, trying to look intimidating, but he just looked desperate and sweaty in his wrinkled suit. "You are going to federal prison, Erin," he threatened loudly, ensuring everyone in the room could hear him. "We know you manipulated the banking system to freeze our assets. Jason was utterly humiliated at the car dealership today because of your petty little revenge scheme. Melissa is at home crying her eyes out because the stress is bad for the baby. You are trying to ruin your pregnant sister-in-law's life. You are doing all of this just because no man will ever want you." My father continued, his voice dripping with venom. My mother stepped closer, completely invading my personal space. She forced crocodile tears into her eyes and let out a loud, dramatic sob, playing the ultimate victim card for the wealthy onlookers surrounding us. "You are a complete failure, Erin," she cried out, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "We gave you absolutely everything. We supported you when you dropped out of school, and we put a roof over your head. You repay us by trying to destroy us and steal from your own brother. You are a sick, pathetic woman who needs serious psychiatric help." The high society guests were watching with wide eyes and open mouths, completely shocked by the sheer vulgarity of my mother's outburst. They were accustomed to quiet dignity and polite disagreements, not a screaming match in the middle of a networking event. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime, hoping the public humiliation would force me to surrender and unfreeze their accounts. She thought that if she embarrassed me enough in front of my professional peers, I would simply crumble and give them exactly what they wanted. She believed I was still the weak little girl who would do anything to avoid a scene. Jason stood right behind them, nodding aggressively and glaring at me with pure hatred. He was acting like a wounded victim who had been unjustly targeted by a cruel older sister. They were all waiting for me to break down and apologize. They were waiting for me to run out of the building in tears, just like I used to do. But I was absolutely not that easily manipulated broken little girl anymore. I maintained my steady gaze as my mother stood there panting and expecting me to fall apart. I did not shrink away from her pointing finger or drop my eyes in fear. Instead, I raised my right hand and caught the eye of the club general manager. Mr. Harrison was a tall, distinguished man who had run the daily operations of the country club for over a decade. He knew every single secret and financial standing of every family in that room. He saw my signal and immediately began moving toward our confrontation, with 3 large security personnel following closely behind him. My father saw the manager approaching and puffed out his chest. He straightened his tie and naturally assumed Mr. Harrison was coming to assist him. Harrison, my father barked, using the manager's last name like he was speaking to a servant. Thank goodness you are here. My daughter has lost her mind and is causing a severe disruption. I need you to have her escorted off the premises immediately. Mr. Harrison did not even look at my father. He gave me a polite, respectful bow. Good evening, Min, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. I deeply apologize for this unfortunate disturbance. How would you like me to handle this situation? My mother let out a loud gasp of indignation. What is wrong with you? She demanded, stepping toward Mr. Harrison. Do you not know who we are? My husband just told you to remove her from the building. We are paying members, and we demand that you remove this unstable woman right now. I kept my hands folded neatly in front of me and smiled at the manager. Mr. Harrison, I said, my voice perfectly calm and measured. These 3 individuals have aggressively interrupted a private professional networking event. They have been shouting profanities and attempting to publicly harass me. As a Platinum Tier board member of this club, I am officially requesting that you enforce our strict zero-tolerance harassment policy. Platinum Tier board member. My father repeated, his voice dropping to a confused whisper. What are you talking about, Erin? You cannot even afford the standard initiation fee here. Mr. Harrison finally turned his attention to my parents, and his expression was completely devoid of warmth. Actually, sir, Miss Erin is one of our most valued board members, he informed my father, his tone dripping with professional disdain. She holds the highest tier of membership we offer. You, on the other hand, hold a standard legacy membership. And I must inform you that the credit cards we have on file for your monthly dues were completely declined earlier this afternoon. Since your account is currently in default, and you are actively violating our conduct policies, you are no longer welcome on these premises. You cannot do this! My mother shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. She looked around at the crowd of onlookers, pleading for someone to intervene. We are respected members of this community. You cannot throw us out like criminals. Jason lunged forward, trying to grab Mr. Harrison's arm. You listen to me, you glorified waiter, Jason snarled. My father brings millions of dollars into this city. If you lay a hand on us, I will sue this club into the ground. Mr. Harrison simply nodded to the security guards. Gentlemen, he said calmly, please escort these non-members to the exit. Do not let them stop to collect their coats. We will have their items mailed to their residence tomorrow morning. They grabbed my father and Jason by their arms. My father tried to yank his arm away, but the guard held firm, forcing him to stumble forward toward the heavy brass doors. My mother let out a genuine scream of panic as another guard placed a firm hand on her shoulder and guided her away from me. You will pay for this, Erin, my mother sobbed as she was practically dragged backward through the crowd. I am your mother. You are a monster. The entire ballroom watched in stunned fascination as the perfect family was physically removed from the venue. The prominent federal judge I had been speaking to earlier was watching the spectacle with a raised eyebrow, taking in every single detail of my parents' humiliating exit. Jason fought the hardest. He was thrashing against the guards, kicking over a small cocktail table and sending a tray of champagne glasses crashing to the floor. Let go of me! Jason screamed, his voice cracking with pure rage. We will destroy you, Erin. We will take everything you have. I stood perfectly still and watched them go. For 33 years, I had watched them tear down other people to make themselves feel taller. I had watched them manipulate and steal from our own family members while wearing perfectly tailored suits and polite smiles. Now the world was finally seeing them for exactly what they were. They were nothing but petty, cruel bullies who crumbled the second their power was stripped away. When the heavy brass doors finally swung shut behind them, sealing them out in the cold Chicago night, the ballroom remained silent for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then Mr. Harrison snapped his fingers and signaled to the waitstaff. The broken glass was swiftly swept away. The string quartet immediately picked up their instruments and began playing a soothing classical melody. The warm, elegant atmosphere of the networking event was instantly restored, as if my family had never even existed. Mr. Harrison turned back to me and gave another slight bow. "My deepest apologies again, Miss Erin," he said softly. "I will personally ensure that their membership is permanently revoked by tomorrow morning. Please let me know if you need anything else tonight." He walked away to check on the other guests, and I took a deep breath. I turned back around to face the federal judge and the commercial real estate developer I had been speaking with before the interruption. I truly expected them to excuse themselves and walk away from the drama. Instead, the judge simply smiled and took a slow sip of his bourbon. "You handle high-pressure situations with remarkable composure," he noted, his eyes crinkling with respect. "I must admit I was completely unaware you sat on the board here. Your firm must be doing exceptionally well to secure a platinum tier at your age." I smiled warmly at him, slipping right back into my professional element. "We prefer to keep a low profile," I explained smoothly. "Our clients value discretion above all else. But yes, the firm is experiencing significant growth this quarter." We spent the next hour discussing the nuances of the Chicago real estate market. No one else mentioned the screaming match or my family being dragged out by security. In this world, power and composure were the only currencies that actually mattered. By maintaining my dignity and utilizing my legitimate authority, I had proven that I truly belonged in that room. As the networking event began to wind down, I excused myself to visit the powder room. I needed a moment of absolute quiet to process everything that had just happened. The marble bathroom was completely empty. I walked very slowly over to the gilded mirror above the sinks and stared at my reflection, taking in the steady, calm eyes looking right back at me. The adrenaline from the confrontation was beginning to fade, leaving behind a sharp, focused clarity. I picked up a hand towel and ran it under the cold water, pressing it gently against my wrists. As the cool water grounded me, my mind replayed the chaotic final moments of my family's expulsion from the ballroom. Just before the heavy brass doors had sealed them out, Jason managed to break free from the security guard for one fraction of a second. He planted his expensive leather shoes against the marble threshold and screamed a final desperate threat that echoed through the grand foyer. It was a threat he thought would absolutely shatter me. "We are going to sell the lakeside cabin, Erin," he shrieked, his face twisted into a mask of pure vindictive malice. "We are going to sell the cabin tomorrow morning and use every single cent to fund a massive lawsuit against you. I am going to take everything you built." He had weaponized the one piece of property that held any genuine emotional significance to me. The lakeside cabin was a retreat nestled along the shores of Lake Geneva. My late grandmother had owned that property for over 40 years. She was a warm, vibrant woman who loved spending her summers planting wildflowers and painting watercolor landscapes on the wraparound wooden deck. When I was a little girl, and the suffocating pressure of my parents' expectations became too much to bear, my grandmother would whisk me away to that cabin. It was the only place in the world where I felt safe and truly loved. She taught me how to fish off the wooden dock and how to bake blueberry pies from scratch. Before she passed away when I was 22, she promised me that the cabin would be mine. She wanted me to have a permanent sanctuary away from the toxic environment my parents had created. She had written it into her original will, specifically stating that the property was to be transferred directly to me upon her passing. But my father had other plans. David had always viewed the cabin not as a home, but as a valuable, undeveloped asset. Within days of her death, he utilized his high-priced corporate lawyers to contest the will. He claimed that because I was young and unstable, I was entirely unfit to manage such a valuable piece of real estate. He manipulated the legal system, tied the estate up in endless bureaucratic red tape, and eventually forced a settlement that transferred the deed directly into his corporate holdings. He legally stole the only thing my grandmother had ever given me. Over the past decade, he had used the cabin as a personal vacation home for himself and Jason, locking me out of the property. Jason knew exactly how much that cabin meant to me. He knew that the very thought of losing it to strangers would have sent the old Erin into a complete downward spiral. He shouted that threat in the country club lobby, expecting to see my face crumple in agony. He expected me to run after him and beg him not to sell my grandmother's legacy. But the old Erin was gone. The woman standing in the country club powder room looking at her reflection was a seasoned private equity chief executive. I knew exactly what Jason's threat actually meant. It was not a display of power or a brilliant strategic maneuver. It was a glaring neon sign of absolute financial desperation. By freezing their personal and corporate credit lines, I had choked off their liquidity. They had no access to cash. They could not pay their mortgages, their luxury car leases, or their country club dues. They needed liquid capital immediately to keep up their wealthy facade, and the only unencumbered asset they had left was that lakeside cabin. They were going to try to liquidate it fast and quietly to survive the freeze. I dried my hands, opened the thread with Thomas, and typed only what he needed to know. Jason had announced that the cabin would be listed within hours. I wanted notice the moment the property entered the market, but nobody from my firm was to contact the family yet. Thomas replied instantly. Understood, we watch then move when you authorize it. I stared at his message and pictured my grandmother standing on the dock, teaching me how to hold a fishing line without frightening the water. Reclaiming the cabin could not be a purchase made in anger. It had to become evidence, leverage, and a correction of what David had stolen. I sent one instruction. Prepare a buyer that cannot be traced to me. Do not submit anything until we review the title history and every signature requirement. The response arrived seconds later. Already pulling the file. I locked my phone and returned to the ballroom. I believed his threat had forced me into panic. In reality, he had identified the asset that would lead him into my next trap. The next 48 hours unfolded exactly as I had anticipated. The total freeze on my father's corporate and personal credit lines acted like a tightening noose around his entire empire. My legal team monitored the fallout from our downtown office, watching as the financial oxygen was slowly drained from their daily lives. Thomas reported that my father's commercial vendors were suddenly demanding upfront cash payments, which he simply did not have. Jason's luxury car leases were bouncing, and my mother's favorite high-end boutiques were quietly declining her daily purchases. Their perfectly curated world of endless capital was shrinking by the hour. The sheer panic must have been suffocating for people who base their entire self-worth on their ability to spend money effortlessly. They were drowning in a sea of frozen assets, and they desperately needed a lifeline. They needed liquid cash to maintain their wealthy facade and to pay off the mounting debts that were suddenly coming due all at once. Just as Jason had threatened in the country club lobby, they officially listed my late grandmother's cherished lakeside cabin for sale. They priced it aggressively, hoping for a fast transaction to save their sinking ship. I was sitting at my desk when Thomas brought me the listing agreement. I did not feel any sadness seeing the photographs of the beautiful wooden deck where my grandmother used to paint her watercolors. I only felt a cold, tactical anticipation. I immediately authorized Thomas to deploy one of our most secure offshore shell corporations. We operated under the guise of an anonymous overseas developer looking for a quiet, private real estate investment in the American Midwest. We submitted an all-cash offer that was 20% above their already aggressive asking price. We attached a strict 10-day closing period to the proposal, making it the most lucrative and fast-paced deal my father had seen in years. We knew they would be completely blinded by the prospect of such a massive and immediate cash infusion. They took the bait within 2 hours of receiving the offer. They were so incredibly desperate to get their hands on that money that they completely waived all standard due diligence on the buyer. They did not ask a single question about who this overseas developer was, or why we were willing to pay such an exorbitant premium for a simple lakeside cabin. They simply saw a giant pile of cash and sprinted blindly toward it. They hired a local title company to expedite the closing paperwork, wanting the funds wired into their accounts as quickly as legally possible. But this is where my trap was truly waiting for them. I had spent years studying the exact legal maneuvers my father had used to steal that cabin from my grandmother's estate after her death. I knew that in his arrogant rush to transfer the deed into his corporate holdings, a decade ago, he had failed to properly clear a specific historical lien that my grandmother had intentionally attached to the property. That lien was a protective measure she had designed to ensure I would always have a legal claim to the cabin. In order to cleanly transfer the title to a new buyer, the processing company would absolutely require my direct physical signature on a specific release document. They needed my legal consent to extinguish my historical claim to the property. Thomas used his extensive network of legal contacts to quietly monitor the transaction as it moved through the title company. He ensured that the necessary release documents were generated and sent directly to my father's corporate office for completion, rather than being mailed to my private residence. We wanted to put the problem right on my father's desk and see exactly how he chose to handle it. I sat in my office and waited, feeling the tension slowly building. I knew my father and my brother better than anyone else in the world. I knew their immense pride and their blinding arrogance. To properly execute the sale and get the cash they so desperately needed, they would have to call me. They would have to swallow their pride, invite me to their office, and politely ask me to sign away my rights to the cabin. They would have to acknowledge my power in the transaction. But my father would never humble himself before a daughter he considered a failure, and Jason was far too prideful to ever beg me for a favor after I had humiliated him at the country club. I knew they would never pick up the phone to call me. I knew they would look for a shortcut because they always believed the rules did not apply to them. They viewed laws and regulations as mere suggestions for lesser people. I spent 2 entire days operating in a state of hyper-focused anticipation. Every time my office phone rang, I wondered if they had actually found the courage to ask for my signature. But my phone remained completely silent. They were scrambling in the dark, convinced they could outsmart the system. On the morning of the third day, Thomas walked into my office without knocking. He did not say a word. He just walked directly to my desk and placed a thick stack of freshly printed closing documents on the glass surface. I looked up at his face and saw a mixture of absolute disbelief and predatory triumph. "They actually did it," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just received the digitized copies from the title company. They submitted the fully executed paperwork an hour ago to finalize the sale." I slowly reached out and pulled the thick stack of documents toward me. I flipped past the standard purchase agreements and the property disclosures until I reached the final page. There, at the very bottom of the historical lion release form, was a signature line with my full legal name printed beneath it. I stared at the dark blue ink resting on that line. It was an incredibly poor attempt at copying my handwriting. The loops were entirely wrong, and the pressure of the pen strokes was far too aggressive. Jason had always possessed terrible handwriting. He had forged my signature to push the sale through without my knowledge. But the sheer audacity of the crime did not stop there. I moved my eyes slightly to the right side of the page to examine the formal witness validation section. My heart pounded rhythmically against my ribs as I read the 2 names clearly printed and signed in bold black ink: David and Susan. My own father and mother had actually acted as the official legal witnesses to the fraudulent document. They had knowingly and willingly watched their eldest son forge my signature on a highly sensitive real estate contract. They had put their own names on the line to validate an obvious lie, simply because they were too arrogant to ask for my help and too desperate for fast cash to wait. They thought they were cleverly bypassing an annoying bureaucratic hurdle to save their sinking suburban lifestyle. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed me the loaded weapon I desperately needed to destroy them permanently. By submitting that forged document to an overseas commercial developer that I secretly controlled, my entire family had just committed federal wire fraud and felony forgery. I had the evidence I needed to ruin them all forever. I stared at the heavy paper resting on the glass surface of my desk. The reality of what my parents and brother had just done settled over the room like a thick, heavy blanket. Thomas stood silently across from me, watching my eyes scan the forged signatures. This was not a minor administrative error or a simple misunderstanding of contract law. This was a deliberate, calculated criminal act. Jason had taken a pen and intentionally replicated my name to steal a piece of real estate. My father, the brilliant corporate patriarch, had attached his own signature right beneath it, validating a lie. My mother had done the exact same thing. They had essentially handed me the keys to their own prison cells. Thomas finally broke the silence, his voice steady, but carrying a sharp edge of disbelief. "We have everything we need, Erin." He tapped the thick file folder resting beside the forged contract. The title company time-stamped the submission. "We have the digital footprint tracing the document upload directly back to your father's private office network. There is absolutely no way they can claim ignorance or blame this on a rogue assistant. They authorized it, they signed it, they sent it." I picked up the forged document and walked slowly over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across the downtown skyscrapers. For 33 years I had been the scapegoat. I had been the one blamed for every single family failure, while Jason was shielded from the consequences of his actions. My father had spent his entire career lecturing me about ethics and corporate responsibility. He loved to stand at the head of the dining room table and talk about the importance of the family name. He believed the rules applied to everyone else but him. Now he had crossed a line that not even his expensive lawyers could erase. "What is our next move?" Thomas asked softly, stepping up to stand beside me. "Do we halt the transaction and notify the authorities immediately?" I shook my head and kept my eyes fixed on the horizon. "Absolutely not," I replied, my voice perfectly calm. "If we stop the sale right now, they might try to claim it was just a draft or a mistake. They might try to wriggle out of it before the actual financial exchange takes place. To solidify the federal wire fraud charges, the money actually has to move across international lines. We need to complete the transaction." Thomas raised an eyebrow, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You want to wire them the money?" "Yes," I said, turning back to face him. "I want our offshore shell corporation to approve the title documents immediately. Tell the title company everything looks perfect. Wire the full cash offer directly into my father's primary corporate account by the end of the business day. Let them have exactly what they want. Let them feel the relief of that cash hitting their bank. Once they accept those funds, the crime is complete and permanent." Thomas nodded sharply and immediately pulled out his phone to contact the escrow officer. I walked back to my desk and sat down, feeling a profound sense of clarity. I was not just reclaiming my grandmother's cabin. I was dismantling the toxic power structure that had suffocated me my entire life. I watched the clock on my wall ticking away the seconds. Within 2 hours, Thomas returned to my office with the final confirmation. The funds had been successfully transferred. Over $3 million had moved from our secure offshore account directly into David's corporate holdings. The title company had officially recorded the deed transfer. My grandmother's cherished lakeside sanctuary was legally back in my possession, hidden safely behind the impenetrable walls of my corporate structure. It was the easiest real estate acquisition I had ever finalized. "Now we wait," I told Thomas. "Let them celebrate. Let them think they won." The transfer appeared on David's corporate dashboard that evening, but the receiving bank placed the international funds under overnight settlement review. My family could see the $3 million balance and believe their crisis was over, yet they could not move a cent until the compliance window closed the following morning. That delay gave Thomas and me time to secure the evidence before Jason began spending. 2 forensic analysts joined us. We copied the escrow instructions, the forged lien release, the witness signatures, and the network logs, showing that the documents had been uploaded from David's office. We preserved the title company timestamps and matched them to the transfer record from my holding company. The chain was clean. The paperwork proved what happened and where it happened. What it did not prove was what each person knew. David could blame an assistant. Susan could claim she signed a page she never read. Jason could insist he believed I had authorized the release. Their explanations would be absurd, but a skilled defense attorney only needed one uncertain juror. Thomas closed the folder. "We can notify Agent Miller now," he said. "The Bureau can stop the funds when they clear." "Not yet," I replied. "If we move before they feel safe, they will stop talking. I want them relaxed enough to boast." Thomas glanced at the calendar. My parents were attending the Chicago Commerce Foundation Gala the following evening. Susan had scheduled a salon appointment, David was having his tuxedo adjusted, and Jason had arranged the family's transportation. They would all be gathered at the house before the event, congratulating themselves on the cabin sale and rehearsing the story they planned to tell their friends. That was the opening I needed. I told Thomas to alert Agent Miller that a formal evidence package was coming, but not to request arrests yet. First, I needed a direct admission tying their knowledge to the forged signature. Once I had that, David would have no employee to blame, Susan would have no innocent misunderstanding to claim, and Jason would have nowhere left to hide completely. I needed something entirely irrefutable. I needed them to admit out loud that they knew exactly what they were doing when they signed my name. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a digital audio recorder, linking it directly to my secure office phone system. I dialed my parents' home number, knowing they would all be gathered there for a late lunch before spending the rest of the day preparing for the upcoming charity gala. The phone rang 3 times before my mother answered. Her voice was breathless and light, floating on the artificial high of their recent cash infusion. "Hello," she sang into the receiver. "Mom, it is Erin," I said, keeping my tone incredibly hesitant and appropriately submissive for them today. "I was hoping I could talk to you and Dad for just a minute." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "Erin, we are incredibly busy right now. Your father is getting his tuxedo tailored, and Jason just arrived to help coordinate our transportation for tonight. Can whatever this is wait until next week?" "It is about the lakeside cabin," I said softly. "I received a strange alert from a property monitoring service I set up years ago. It said the deed was officially transferred to a new corporate buyer yesterday morning. I am just so confused because I never signed the release for the historical lien." A long, very tense, uncomfortable silence stretched across the open phone line now. I pressed the record button on my device, watching the red light blink steadily. I could hear muffled whispering in the background as my mother covered the receiver. A moment later, the line clicked loudly as she put me on speakerphone. "Erin," my father barked, his voice laced with pure annoyance. "What is this nonsense about you monitoring my properties?" "It is not your property, Dad," I replied, injecting a note of forced naivety into my voice. "Grandma left it to me, and even though you took the title, I still held the lien. The sale cannot be legal without my signature. I just want to know what happened so we can clear this up before the title company realizes it was a mistake today." "You do not need to worry about the title company," my father said dismissively. "The sale is finalized and the funds have cleared entirely. We sold it to an overseas developer who offered us a massive cash premium. It was a brilliant business move that you would not possibly understand." "But how did you bypass the signature requirement?" I pressed, letting my voice waver, as if I were on the verge of tears. "Did you somehow convince a judge to override my legal claim?" Jason let out a loud, mocking laugh from somewhere deep in the background. "God, you are so unbelievably dramatic, Erin," he sneered. "No one went to a judge. We just handled it internally to save precious time for us right now." "Handled it internally," I repeated, ensuring the recording picked up every single syllable loud and clear. "What exactly does that mean, Jason?" "It means we took care of it." My mother interrupted, her tone shifting from annoyed to patronizing. "You were being so difficult at the country club the other night, embarrassing us in front of all those important people. We knew you would just use the cabin signature to throw another tantrum and drag out the process. We needed the cash quickly to handle some temporary liquidity issues. So we signed your name for you. It is for the good of the family." The sheer terrifying casualness of her full confession sent a massive emotional shockwave directly through my chest, right then and there. They had committed a federal felony, and she was speaking about it as if she had simply borrowed my sweater without asking. "You forged my signature?" I asked, making sure the legal terms were stated plainly. "Oh, please stop using such ugly words, Erin," my mother scoffed. "You are making a huge mountain out of a tiny molehill. We signed your name for you. It is for the good of the family. Just like when we signed your name to take out those student loans for Jason's tuition 5 years ago. You survived that just fine, did you not? The entire world seemed to completely stop spinning in place. The air in my beautiful modern office grew suddenly freezing cold all around me right then. The city sounds outside my window faded into absolute nothingness. My breath hitched in my throat as the devastating weight of my mother's casual admission crashed down on me. 5 years ago, I was enrolled in a prestigious master's program at Northwestern University. I was at the top of my class and finally building a life completely independent of my toxic family. I was weeks away from securing a massive commercial real estate internship when I received a devastating letter from my bank. My credit score had been utterly obliterated. Multiple massive loans had been taken out in my name and deliberately defaulted on. The financial ruin was so sudden and severe that I lost my apartment and my academic funding completely and instantly then. The university required a clean financial background check for the internship program, and with my credit completely destroyed, I was immediately disqualified. I was forced to drop out of my master's program and take a low-paying entry-level accounting job, just to survive. For 5 years, I had lived with the crushing shame of that specific financial disaster. I had spent countless nights crying in a tiny studio apartment believing my identity had been stolen by some faceless hacker. I had spent thousands of hours rebuilding my credit score from absolute zero, painstakingly repairing a financial profile that I thought a stranger had ruined. But it was not a stranger at all. It was actually my very own parents who did this terrible thing. They had secretly used my social security number and my identity to take out massive student loans to fund Jason's extravagant lifestyle and pay for his useless business degree. They had willingly destroyed my future to subsidize his failure. And my mother was bringing it up now as a casual anecdote to justify their latest crime. "Are you still there, Erin?" my mother asked, breaking through the ringing silence in my ears. "I need to go finish my hair appointment. We will see you at the gala tonight. Just try to wear something flattering for once." I did not say a single word. I gently placed the receiver back onto the cradle, disconnecting the line. I pressed the stop button and sat down completely still. The silence in my office felt heavier than it ever had before. For 5 grueling years, I had tortured myself with guilt, believing that I had somehow been careless with my personal information. I had spent countless nights wondering which sketchy website or compromised credit card reader had led to my financial ruin and the loss of my academic dreams. But there was no faceless hacker sitting in a dark room halfway across the world. The thieves who had stolen my future had been sitting at my own dining room table passing the mashed potatoes. My own parents had sacrificed my entire future just to cover the tracks of their golden child. A cold, profound numbness washed over my entire body, replacing the initial shock with an icy, unbreakable resolve. I picked up my phone and immediately dialed Thomas. He answered on the first ring, his voice sharp and alert. I have the confession, I told him, my tone completely devoid of any emotion. My mother just admitted on a recorded line that they forged my signature for the lakeside cabin sale. She also casually confessed that they stole my identity 5 years ago to take out the fraudulent student loans for Jason. Thomas let out a sharp breath on the other end of the line. That is the final nail in their coffin, Erin. We have absolute concrete proof of a pattern of identity theft and financial fraud. The federal prosecutors are going to have a field day with this evidence. I looked out the window at the sprawling city below me, feeling an absolute sense of power. The time for waiting is officially over, Thomas, I said. It is time to snap the trap completely shut. By the next morning, the offshore wire transfer had fully cleared and settled into my father's primary corporate holding account. Thomas and our forensic accounting team were closely monitoring the financial movements through the escrow records and the banking alerts we set up. We did not have to wait very long for my brother to make his first fatal mistake. Within 2 hours of the funds becoming fully accessible, Jason executed a massive external wire transfer. He did not buy a new luxury car or invest in commercial real estate. He immediately wired exactly $100,000 to an offshore account associated with a notorious illicit sports gambling syndicate. Jason had been hiding massive gambling debts from everyone, and he had just used the proceeds of a fraudulent real estate transaction to pay off a criminal enterprise. He had just escalated a domestic forgery case into a massive federal money laundering incident. I smiled as Thomas handed me the printed confirmation of Jason's wire transfer. My brother had always been his own worst enemy, but this was a masterpiece of absolute self-destruction. "It is time," I told Thomas, standing up from my desk and smoothing the front of my jacket. "Send the legal notices right now. Send them by priority certified courier to my father's boardroom, and make sure Jason receives his copy directly in his hands." Thomas nodded, his eyes gleaming with intense anticipation. The legal notice was a meticulously crafted document designed to deliver maximum psychological and legal devastation. It formally informed David and Jason Wilson that the anonymous overseas developer who had purchased the lakeside cabin was actually a holding company completely owned by me. The document explicitly detailed how the title transfer they had submitted contained a forged signature and fraudulent witness attestations. It plainly laid out the severe federal statutes they had deliberately violated, including felony wire fraud, identity theft, and criminal forgery. I wanted them to read those terrifying words and realize that their clever little shortcut had just legally bound them to an inevitable federal prison sentence. I wanted them to finally know that the daughter they had treated like disposable garbage was the architect of their total downfall. I sat in my office and waited for the delivery confirmation. It took exactly 40 whole minutes for the certified couriers to reach my father's downtown corporate headquarters. According to the receipts, the heavy envelopes were handed directly to David and Jason while they were sitting in their corner offices, celebrating their supposed financial victory. I imagined the exact moment my father tore open the seal and pulled out the crisp white pages. I pictured the arrogant smile completely vanishing from his face as his eyes scanned the dense legal terminology and zeroed in on my exact name, listed as the sole proprietor of the purchasing corporation. I imagined the absolute suffocating panic seizing his chest as he realized that the millions of dollars currently sitting in his bank account were essentially radioactive evidence of his own undeniable crimes. I did not have to rely on my imagination for very long. Less than an hour after the documents were delivered, my private office line began ringing incessantly. The caller identification displayed my father's private cell phone number. I let it ring. He called 6 more times in rapid succession, leaving no voicemails. He was unraveling completely, losing the iron grip of control he had maintained over our family for decades. He thought he had outsmarted me, but he had just walked blindly into a reinforced steel cage and handed me the padlock key. But my father was a cornered predator, and cornered predators always look for a way to bite their way out of a trap. He was not a man who ever accepted defeat gracefully or took responsibility for his own malicious actions. He had spent his entire career shifting blame onto his subordinates and escaping accountability through expensive legal loopholes. I knew he would try to find a way to redirect the incoming explosion onto someone else. I just did not realize how far he was willing to go until Thomas burst into my office later that afternoon, his face flushed with urgent concern. "We have a major situation," Erin Thomas said quickly, closing the heavy glass door behind him and pulling the blinds shut. "I just got off the phone with an informant inside your father's corporate compliance department. David is in a state of total panic. The moment he read your legal notice, he realized the absolute severity of the federal charges heading his way. But instead of contacting his defense attorneys to negotiate a surrender, he has called an emergency closed-door meeting with his corporate board of directors for first thing tomorrow morning." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the smooth glass desk. "What exactly is he planning to do at this emergency board meeting, Thomas?" Thomas took a deep breath, his expression deadly serious. "He is planning to completely restructure his corporate liability hierarchy. He is drafting falsified documents that retroactively name you as the primary executive officer in charge of the Lakeside Cabin Holding Company. He is going to present these forged documents to the board and claim that you were the one who orchestrated the entire fraudulent sale from the inside. He plans to frame you for everything." The sheer terrifying audacity of his plan hung heavily in the freezing air of my office. He was not just trying to escape. He was actively trying to send his own daughter to federal prison to protect his precious empire. A slow smile spread across my face. "Let him hold his meeting," I said softly. "We are going to be there tomorrow to watch him burn." David stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, his tailored suit projecting the false authority he had relied on for decades. I stood just outside the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, with Thomas watching the performance unfold. Through the pristine glass, I could see my father distributing thick, glossy folders to the 12 members of the board of directors. He gestured dramatically toward a projected slide showing my face next to a web of fabricated financial transfers. Even through the soundproof glass, his posture screamed of righteous indignation. He was painting himself as the tragic patriarch betrayed by a greedy, vindictive daughter who had supposedly infiltrated his corporate accounts to steal millions. Jason sat to his right, nodding with practiced sorrow, while my mother dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a perfectly choreographed lie designed to destroy my life. Thomas checked his watch and gave me a single sharp nod. The federal agents were in position downstairs. It was time. I pushed open the heavy glass doors, the sudden noise interrupting my father mid-sentence. The entire room turned to look at me. The board members, many of whom had known me since I was a child, wore expressions of shock and discomfort. David froze, his hands suspended in the air over his fabricated dossier. The silence was absolute. "You are not authorized to be in this building." Erin, my father, barked, his face immediately flushing with anger. "Security will be escorting you out. This is a private corporate meeting, and your presence here is a severe legal violation." I walked calmly into the room, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. Thomas followed close behind me, carrying a single black briefcase. I did not stop until I reached the opposite end of the long table directly facing my father. I rested my hands on the smooth wood and met his furious gaze, completely unfazed by him. "Since you are calling for a formal board vote to file criminal charges against me, Dad, I think I have the right to attend my own trial," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "After all, corporate bylaws require the accused to have a chance to respond before the board takes legal action on behalf of the company." A murmur spread among the directors. Richard, the senior board member and a longtime associate of my father, cleared his throat. "David, perhaps we should hear what Erin has to say. The allegations in this dossier are incredibly severe, and we should ensure all protocols are strictly followed today." My father slammed his hand flat on the table, the sudden noise making my mother flinch. "There is nothing to hear, Richard. She orchestrated a fraudulent real estate transaction to siphon over $3 million from our operating capital. She used a shell company to buy my mother's lakeside cabin, manipulated the title documents, and forged signatures to bypass the historical lien. I have the digital footprint proving the documents were routed through her downtown office. She is trying to ruin this family and completely destroy this business for revenge." Jason leaned forward, sneering at me from across the room. "You always were jealous of us, Erin, but stealing from the company is a federal crime. You are going to prison, and I will personally make sure you stay there." I looked at my brother, feeling absolutely nothing but pity for his blinding ignorance. I turned my attention to the board members, who were anxiously flipping through the fake dossiers my father had provided. "The digital footprint my father is referring to is entirely real," I told the room, watching David's smug smile falter slightly. "The holding company that purchased the lakeside cabin does belong to me, and the title documents were indeed routed through my office earlier this week." My father threw his hands in the air, looking at the board triumphantly. "You see, she admits it. She admits to the embezzlement and the fraud right in front of everyone. We have our confession. We can vote right now." "I am not finished, David," I said, my voice cutting through his celebration like ice. "I own the purchasing company, which means I was the buyer in this transaction. I wired $3 million of my own legally earned capital into your corporate account to purchase the property. I did not steal a single cent from this company. In fact, I just provided you with the massive cash injection you desperately needed because your corporate credit lines are completely frozen." Richard frowned, looking between me and my father. "David, You told us this overseas developer was an independent entity and that the funds were clean. Are you saying Erin actually bought the property and that you accepted her personal money? She bought it illegally? My mother suddenly interjected, her voice shrill and defensive. She manipulated the paperwork to steal it from us, and she tricked us into accepting those funds. I smiled at my mother. Thank you for bringing up the paperwork, Mom. That is the exact reason Thomas and I are here today. I nodded to Thomas, who opened his black briefcase and extracted a small audio speaker, placing it carefully in the center of the mahogany table. He then handed a certified copy of the cabin's title release document directly to Richard, making sure everyone could see it. If you look at the final page of that release, Richard, you will see my signature, extinguishing the historical lien, I explained calmly. However, I never signed that document. I never authorized that sale. My father, my mother, and my brother forged my signature to illegally push the sale through, completely unaware that they were selling the property directly back to me. They committed the fraud, not me, I stated. That is an outrageous lie, my father roared, his composure finally shattering. You cannot prove anything. You signed that paper, and now you are trying to frame us to cover up your own financial crimes. The board will never believe your ridiculous fabrications when I have all the solid evidence. I did not argue with him. I simply looked at Thomas and nodded again. Thomas pressed a button on his phone, connecting to the speaker on the table. The boardroom fell dead silent as my mother's voice filled the space, crisp and unmistakable, exposing the deep rot inside my family. We signed your name for you. It is for the good of the family. Just like when we signed your name to take out those student loans for Jason's tuition 5 years ago. You survived that just fine, did you not? We just handled it internally to save precious time. The recording echoed off the glass walls, leaving absolute devastation in its wake. The color instantly drained from my mother's face. She pressed her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror as she realized I had recorded our phone call. Jason slumped back into his leather chair, staring at the speaker as if it were a bomb that had just detonated. My father looked around the room, his chest heaving as he searched the faces of his directors for any remaining support. But there was absolutely none to be found. Richard dropped the forged title document onto the table, his expression twisting into pure disgust. You lied, David. He stood up. The federal agents are waiting outside now. Richard's announcement froze the room. David looked toward the glass doors, then back at the directors, calculating whether authority outrage or another lie could still save him. No one is entering my boardroom without my permission, he said. I am the founder and majority shareholder of this company. Richard, sit down before you create a liability you cannot undo. Richard remained standing. The other directors slowly closed the fabricated dossiers David had distributed. Their attention had shifted from me to him. I raised one hand toward the doors. The agents remained outside, preserving evidence and blocking every exit while the board heard the truth. The forged cabin documents are only one part of this, I said. Dad did not call this meeting merely to accuse me. He called it because the cabin proceeds exposed a much larger financial collapse. Thomas connected my tablet to the projector. The image of my face and David's false transaction map vanished. In its place appeared the company's actual cash ledgers, creditor schedules, and investor accounts. For the past 5 years, David has been removing operating capital from restricted investor funds, I told the board. He concealed the withdrawals through temporary transfers among property subsidiaries, then replaced the missing balances with short-term commercial debt before quarterly reviews. On paper, the accounts appeared whole. In reality, each cycle left the company deeper in debt. Richard moved closer to the screen. He pointed to a sequence of transfers highlighted in red. These payments went to private limited liability companies. Who owns them? Jason shifted in his chair. Thomas advanced the slide. The ownership records appeared beside photographs of luxury vehicles, hotel invoices, casino transfers, and country club payments. Those companies were controlled by Jason, I said. Investor money paid his leases, vacations, personal taxes, and gambling losses. When one account ran low, David moved money from another project and labeled it an emergency development expense. That is a lie, David shouted. Those were executive advances authorized under my compensation agreement. Then show the authorization, Richard said. David opened his mouth, but no answer came. I displayed the original board resolutions. None authorized the transfers. Directors began demanding why project reserves had paid for Jason's cars and why delayed sale proceeds appeared in his accounts. A second director, Margaret Cole, opened the project schedule on her laptop and compared it with the figures on the screen. She managed the pension partnership that had financed 3 of David's largest office developments. Her expression changed as she found the same withdrawals in her records. "We were told these reserves remained untouched," she said. "David, you certified them personally every quarter." David attempted to answer, but Margaret turned her laptop toward the board. The reserve confirmations carried his electronic signature and the compliance code assigned to Jason's department. Thomas explained how the scheme worked. Money left restricted accounts shortly after each certification traveled through a property management subsidiary and returned before the next formal review. The temporary repayment made the balance look intact, while interest and vendor obligations accumulated elsewhere. "That is why the company constantly needed new credit," I said. David was not borrowing to expand. I was borrowing to conceal the previous withdrawal. I displayed a timeline matching each debt extension to one of Jason's major personal expenses. A loan secured against a suburban office park appeared 2 days before his destination, wedding anniversary trip. A refinancing of warehouse property preceded a 6-figure payment to an online betting intermediary. An emergency construction advance was followed by the purchase of 2 imported vehicles. Several directors had approved those loans because David told them temporary market conditions required additional liquidity. They now understood that every approval had been obtained through manipulated reports. Margaret removed her glasses. "How much is missing before interest, penalties, and the cabin transaction? Just over $8 million, I replied. "Some of it can be recovered from property sales and frozen accounts. The rest will require litigation." The number silenced the room. These were not abstract bookkeeping irregularities. They represented retirement money, employee benefits, and capital committed by people who had trusted the board. David's fraud had not merely endangered his family company. It had transferred the cost of Jason's lifestyle to everyone seated around him. No one at the table could pretend any longer that this was a private disagreement between relatives. Jason stood and pointed at me. "She had access to our systems. She could have altered every number after buying the cabin. This is revenge because she was never important to this family." I looked directly at him. "The records did not come from your internal accounting system. They came from the bank's escrow agent's tax filings and creditor reports. Your own signatures appear on the disbursement requests." Thomas placed certified copies before Richard. Each carried independent timestamps and verification codes that no internal spreadsheet could alter. Susan began crying. She turned toward the directors as though tears could restore the family image. "We did not know anything about investor money," she said. "David handled the business. Jason only received what his father gave him." The next slide showed Susan witnessing transfers from a restricted real estate fund into a household company that paid her personal expenses. "You signed the certifications, Mom," I said. "Each one states that the funds were being used for company purposes." David slammed both hands onto the table. "Enough. This board has no authority to conduct a trial. Erin is not an officer, director, or shareholder. She is an outside creditor manufacturing a scandal to seize our assets." That was the sentence I had been waiting for. "You are correct about one thing," I said. "I am your creditor." Thomas removed a thick set of contracts from his briefcase and distributed them around the table. The first pages identified the original lenders. The following assignments showed how the loans had been transferred during the previous 18 months to separate investment vehicles owned by my firm. David stared at the documents without touching them. "Your company has not been operating on its own capital," I continued. "It survived by pledging its properties, receivables, subsidiaries, and controlling shares as collateral. When the original lenders decided your risk was too high, they sold the debt. I purchased it quietly, one loan at a time." Jason shook his head. "You are a bookkeeper. You could not buy this company's debt. I founded the forensic accounting and private wealth management firm that your father praised at my birthday dinner. We manage billions in client assets and maintain a private equity division specializing in distressed companies. The institution David called his strongest financial partner belongs to me. The boardroom became completely still. David finally pulled the first agreement toward him. He flipped through the assignment pages, then stopped at the name of my holding company. The arrogance drained from his face. These assignments do not give you ownership, he said. Debt is not equity. Not automatically, I replied. That is why you should have read the collateral provisions before signing each extension. Thomas directed the board to the default clause. Fraud or misuse of restricted funds triggered immediate default, allowing the secured creditor to accelerate the debt seize pledged shares and appoint interim management. Richard read the clause twice. Then he looked at David. You pledged your voting control, David said nothing. At 9 that morning, after the forged cabin proceeds entered the corporate account, and Jason transferred $100,000 to an offshore gambling syndicate, my firm issued a formal notice of default. An independent collateral agent verified the breach. The pledged shares and voting rights transferred to my holding company under the agreement David had signed. I advanced to the final document. It carried the collateral agent's seal and the time of transfer. As of 9 this morning, I control the majority voting interest, I said. David and Jason are removed, and a compliance team now controls every account and record. David pushed away from the table so violently that his chair struck the wall. You planned this for years. I prepared for the day your lies finally became more expensive than your assets. You created the default yourself. He turned toward the board. Do not listen to her. Vote to reject the transfer. I built this company. Richard closed the loan file. You pledged it, David. Then you stole from it. One by one, the directors placed David's fabricated dossiers in the center of the table. No one defended him. Jason moved toward the side door. An agent appeared behind the glass and blocked it. Jason stopped. I projected the $100,000 transfer from the cabin proceeds to an offshore gambling account linked to Jason's prior betting debts. That money was mine, Jason said. Dad gave it to me. It came from a real estate transaction completed with a forged signature, I replied. You moved those proceeds across international banking channels to satisfy an illegal gambling debt. The agents outside have the transfer record, the forged release, the title company logs, and Mom's recorded admission. Jason looked at David. Tell them you ordered it. Tell them I only signed because you said it was allowed. David stepped away from his son. I never told you to forge anything. The betrayal landed instantly. Jason's face collapsed as he realized his father was already trying to sacrifice him. Susan rushed between them. Stop blaming each other. Erin, this has gone far enough. You proved your point. Give the company back, withdraw the complaint, and we can resolve this privately. Privately was where you hid every crime I said. That option is gone. I looked around the table at the directors, then at the three people who had spent my life treating me as disposable. I do not just own the loft you tried to enter, and I do not just own the cabin you tried to steal. I control the debt, the collateral, and the voting shares you pledged to protect your illusion. This company now belongs to the entity you dismissed as my bookkeeping hobby. You are all removed from its operations. The directors no longer looked at me as David's daughter. They saw the secured creditor, controlling shareholder, and forensic accountant who had mapped the theft they failed to detect. Their anger was not sentimental. It came from realizing David had placed every investment, employee, and property beneath the weight of his family's fraud. I turned toward the doors. Agent Miller entered with 3 investigators, announced an evidence preservation order, and warned everyone against altering records. 2 agents moved toward Jason, while another approached David. Jason backed into the table. You cannot arrest me because she bought a cabin, he shouted. Agent Miller held up the forged release in a clear evidence sleeve. We are not arresting you for buying a cabin. The agents stepped forward. One took Jason by the shoulder. Another moved toward David, who stood motionless, as the third agent collected his devices and directed him toward the door. There was nowhere to run. The heavy steel handcuffs locked around Jason's wrists with a finality that echoed through the otherwise silent boardroom. My brother, the golden child, who had never faced a single consequence in his entire pampered life, was now weeping openly, his knees buckling as the federal agents hauled him toward the double-glass doors. My father stripped of his pride, his company, and his freedom shuffled behind him like a broken shell of a man, his eyes staring blankly at the polished hardwood floor. The board members watched in absolute horror, their faces pale as they witnessed the total dismantling of the Wilson legacy. The air in the room felt entirely different now, scrubbed clean of the toxic arrogance that my father and brother had breathed into this space for decades. I stood near the head of the mahogany table, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting lightly on the cold glass surface of my tablet. I felt Thomas step slightly closer to me, a silent, steady presence validating the absolute victory we had just secured. The federal agents escorted David and Jason out of the room, their heavy footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. But the final act of this miserable family drama was not quite over yet. My mother was still sitting in her oversized leather executive chair, her body trembling so violently that the chair itself seemed to vibrate. For a long moment, she simply stared at the empty space where her husband and son had been standing just seconds before. The reality of her new existence was crashing down upon her in crushing waves. The endless credit limits, the lavish country club memberships, the designer wardrobes funded by stolen investor capital. Everything was gone completely and forever. She was no longer the untouchable matriarch of a corporate empire. She was the complicit wife of a federal criminal and the mother of an embezzler, and she was entirely alone. Slowly, her wide, tear-filled eyes shifted away from the empty doorway and locked onto me. I watched the frantic calculations running through her mind. She was searching for a lifeline, a way to survive the burning wreckage of the life she had helped destroy. And looking at me, she saw her only remaining option. Susan pushed herself up from the leather chair, her movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Her expensive designer heels clicked erratically against the polished floor as she stumbled toward the head of the table. The remaining board members instinctively leaned back in their chairs, wanting absolutely no part in whatever desperate display was about to unfold. I did not move a single muscle. I watched her approach with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a predictable experiment. She looked entirely pathetic, her carefully styled hair now slightly disheveled, her expensive makeup smeared by the tears streaming down her face. She reached me and threw herself forward, her trembling hands grasping desperately at the fabric of my tailored designer coat. Her fingers clutched the expensive wool as if it were a physical lifeline pulling her out of deep water. "Erin, please!" she wailed, her voice cracking with a raw, ugly desperation that filled the quiet boardroom. "You have to stop this right now. You have to tell those federal agents there has been some terrible misunderstanding. You cannot just stand there and let them take your father and your brother away to prison. We have lost the company, and that is fine, you can have it all. Just please call the authorities off." I looked down at her hands gripping my coat, feeling absolutely nothing. I did not feel pity, I did not feel anger, and I certainly did not feel any lingering daughterly affection. I simply felt a profound, clarifying emptiness. I let her continue her pathetic performance, allowing the entire board of directors to witness the exact kind of manipulation she had subjected me to my entire life. "We are your family, Erin." Susan sobbed loudly, pulling on my coat, her voice echoing shrilly off the soundproof glass walls. "We share the same blood. You cannot do this to your own mother and your own brother. We raised you. We gave you everything you needed. You are supposed to protect us. How can you be so cruel and heartless to the people who brought you into this world? Look at what you are doing to me." Her tears fell onto the sleeve of my coat, leaving dark, damp spots on the pristine fabric. She was playing the ultimate victim, hoping that public shame and familial guilt would somehow force me to surrender the power I had just rightfully claimed. It was the exact same tactic she had used 5 years ago, when she convinced me that my ruined credit score was somehow my own fault, gaslighting me into believing I was the burden, while she actively funded Jason's gambling habits with my stolen identity. I reached down slowly and peeled her trembling fingers off my coat one by one. I did it with careful, deliberate precision, treating her hands as if they were covered in something incredibly distasteful. I took a half step back, smoothing the front of my jacket, completely separating myself from her physical grasp. I looked down at her with absolute chilling calm. The entire boardroom held its collective breath, waiting for my response. "You stopped being my family the day you told me I was a failure while stealing my future to fund his," I stated, my voice echoing with icy, undeniable authority. I watched her eyes widen in shock as the truth of my words struck her. "Go find an Uber, Mom. I hear they are reliable." The words landed with the devastating force of a physical blow. Susan gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. The sheer brutality of my dismissal completely shattered whatever remaining hope she had clung to. She looked around the glass-walled room, her eyes darting frantically from Richard to the other board members, silently begging someone, anyone, to intervene on her behalf and reprimand me for my cruelty. But the men and women seated around that mahogany table simply stared back at her with expressions of cold contempt and deep disgust. They had just seen the undeniable proof that this woman had happily conspired to steal millions of dollars of their investor funds to protect a gambling addict. They knew she had forged her own daughter's signature on federal documents. There was absolutely no sympathy left for Susan Wilson in this building or anywhere else in this city. Seeing the cold rejection in the eyes of the board members, my mother finally realized the absolute totality of her defeat. The social standing she had worshipped her entire life was completely gone. She had no money, no husband to protect her, no golden son to fawn over, and no daughter willing to act as her sacrificial lamb ever again. She let out a low, wretched whimper, a sound of pure defeat that held no theatrical manipulation, only genuine, terrifying realization of her new bleak reality. She turned away from me, her shoulders slumped, her posture broken and defeated. She walked slowly toward the heavy double doors, her footsteps dragging across the hardwood floor. She did not look back. She pushed through the glass doors and disappeared into the outer hallway, stepping out into a world where she was completely powerless and irrelevant. The heavy glass doors swung shut, sealing the boardroom in a profound, ringing silence. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, looking at the empty leather chairs where my family had sat just moments before. Richard and the remaining board members watched me with a mixture of awe and trepidation, waiting for my next move. I did not give them a triumphant speech or gloat over the ruins of my father's empire. I simply took my seat at the head of the table, opened my tablet, and began outlining the immediate restructuring protocols to stabilize the bleeding company. The transition of power was swift, clinical, and completely devoid of the emotional theatrics my family had always relied upon. Thomas stood by my side, distributing the new operational directives, while the board quickly fell into line, recognizing that I was the only person capable of saving their investments. By the time I left the obsidian glass building that evening, the Wilson dynasty, as the business world knew, it had been thoroughly and permanently dismantled. The wind outside had died down, leaving a crisp, clear night that mirrored the absolute clarity in my mind. The federal case moved slowly, but the evidence left Jason almost no room to bargain. The forged lien release carried his handwriting, the title portal recorded the upload from David's office, and the $100,000 gambling payment connected him directly to the proceeds. Melissa initially appeared beside him at 2 hearings, still dressed for cameras, and insisting their marriage was strong. The moment the court froze the remaining vehicles and personal accounts, she filed for separation. She moved in with her parents, took the belongings legally registered in her name, and stopped answering Jason's calls. Facing wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, and conspiracy charges, Jason accepted a plea agreement. 7 months after the boardroom confrontation, a federal judge sentenced him to 84 months in prison and ordered restitution. He cried as the marshals led him away, not because he understood what he had done to me, but because the consequences had finally reached him. David's downfall followed a different path. The agents had escorted him from the boardroom for questioning and seized his devices, but his age cooperation and decision to provide access to the shadow accounts changed the final criminal disposition. He surrendered his passport, resigned from every corporate role, and entered a negotiated agreement that required full cooperation with the investor recovery process. The agreement did not protect his wealth or reputation. The board filed civil claims against him. Regulators permanently barred him from acting as a corporate officer, and the pledged collateral consumed nearly everything he owned. The mansion was sold, his private accounts were emptied for restitution, and his remaining assets disappeared in personal bankruptcy. The man who once controlled every room in Chicago ended up in a cramped rental writing furious letters to former associates who never replied. He avoided a long prison sentence, but he lost the company, the authority, and the audience that had made him feel powerful. The investigation also exposed how widely David's misconduct had spread. Several retirement trusts, small business partnerships, and family investment accounts had been used as temporary sources of cash, without the beneficiaries' knowledge. My forensic team worked with court-appointed monitors to reconstruct the missing balances transaction by transaction. Properties that could operate profitably were separated from the fraudulent holding structure and placed under independent management. Projects that existed only to hide debt were sold. Employees who had followed legitimate procedures kept their jobs, while executives who had approved false reports were removed. The recovered funds did not erase every loss, but they prevented innocent investors from carrying the full cost of David's decisions. I refused to let the cleanup become another performance about my family. Every public statement focused on the people whose money and livelihoods had been endangered. That choice mattered. Former clients came forward with records. Regulators accelerated the recovery process, and several directors voluntarily returned bonuses they had received during the years of false reporting. By the time the criminal hearings ended, the Wilson name no longer represented prestige. It appeared in court filings, compliance seminars, and cautionary articles about what happens when family entitlement is allowed to overrule financial controls inside one failing private family company. Susan was not arrested in the boardroom because Agent Miller still needed her cooperation against David and Jason. Weeks later, prosecutors charged her for the false witness attestations and the older identity theft scheme. Her attorney negotiated probation, mandatory restitution, and community service in exchange for her recorded testimony and the surrender of assets purchased with diverted company money. To Susan, the social consequences were worse than the legal ones. The country club permanently revoked her membership. Charity committees removed her name from their programs. Friends who had attended her dinners stopped returning calls once the scandal became public. When the mansion was seized, she moved into a small rental on the industrial edge of the city. I saw her once carrying groceries up the cracked steps without a driver-designer coat or anyone rushing to help. She looked older and smaller, but I felt no satisfaction. I felt distance. Her life was no longer my responsibility, and her loneliness was not a debt I was required to pay. As I sat in my downtown office months later, reviewing the soaring profit margins of my newly acquired company, I finally felt the absolute closure I had been seeking. The toxic anchor that had dragged me down for 33 years was officially gone, replaced by an empire I had built entirely on my own merit. They had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was a worthless failure, an invisible disappointment unworthy of their respect. But the undeniable truth was that I had always been the strongest person in that room. I had not just survived their cruelty, I had conquered it entirely. The restructuring of Wilson Corporate Properties was not an act of revenge. It was the only responsible way to separate viable assets from the fraudulent structure David had created. Over the following 3 months, my forensic team reviewed every building development contract, subsidiary, and lease portfolio. We sold projects that existed only to hide debt, terminated inflated executive agreements, and auctioned the vehicles Jason had treated as personal property. Stable buildings with honest managers were transferred into a new operating company, preserving tenant services and protecting employees who had never participated in the fraud. Directors who had ignored obvious warning signs were removed, while property managers and accounting staff were offered positions under the new compliance system. Every recovered dollar was assigned first to taxes, secured obligations, employee benefits, and investor restitution. When the process was complete, the Wilson name came down from the headquarters. In its place, we installed the steel logo of my own firm. I had not inherited my father's empire. I had dismantled the corruption inside it and saved what deserved to survive. The first protected distribution from the recovered assets went to Aunt Carol. 5 years earlier, a severe stroke had left her partially paralyzed and dependent on physical therapy, skilled nursing, and a controlled routine. David had never moved her into a state institution, but he had repeatedly threatened to do so whenever the trust balance became useful as leverage. I ended that risk permanently. Working with Thomas, I replaced the vulnerable quarterly arrangement with an independent medical trust funded beyond her projected lifetime needs. David, Susan, and Jason were barred from serving as trustees, beneficiaries, advisors, or emergency contacts. The facility received a full year of payments in advance, along with authority to contact me directly if any account problem appeared. I also arranged therapy, a weekend nurse, and transportation that allowed Carol to visit the lake when her health permitted. The next Sunday, I found her sitting by the window with a book open on her lap. She recognized me immediately, squeezed my hand with her stronger fingers, and asked whether I had finally learned to stop apologizing for taking up space. I laughed, then cried. For the first time, the money connected to the Wilson family was protecting someone instead of controlling her. The remaining capital from the liquidation fueled the aggressive expansion of my own financial firm. We successfully acquired 3 smaller competing accounting firms, completely absorbing their lucrative client lists and permanently securing our absolute dominance over the entire regional market. I was no longer just a successful forensic accountant. I was the undisputed titan of the financial sector. The corporate world that had once dismissed me as David Wilson's unremarkable daughter now spoke my name with a mixture of profound respect and healthy fear. My days were filled with high-stakes negotiations and massive corporate acquisitions, but the crushing, suffocating anxiety that had defined my early career was entirely gone. I operated with a clear, untroubled mind, free from the relentless ghost of my family's manufactured disapproval. Every victory was mine alone, built on a foundation of absolute truth and relentless hard work. 1 year after the boardroom confrontation, I stood on the balcony of my penthouse at the top of the high-rise I owned. I had not sold the loft my family tried to take. I kept it as a residence and a reminder that protecting a home is different from being trapped inside it. My penthouse rose above the office floor, where my firm operated, with the city spreading 50 stories beneath the terrace. Through the open glass doors, I heard laughter and the clink of glasses. The building no longer represented a secret I needed to hide from my family. It represented choice. Every deed, lease, and security code belonged to a structure I had built and acquired. No trust executor could freeze it, no brother could change its locks, and no parent could decide who deserved the space. My chosen family had happily gathered to celebrate the incredible record-breaking third-quarter profits of our firm. Thomas was standing by the marble kitchen island, animatedly telling a story to a group of my brilliant senior analysts. Richard, who had happily accepted a position as my senior advisory consultant, was pouring an expensive vintage red wine while laughing at a joke made by my lead legal counsel. These were not people bound to me by the toxic, inescapable obligation of shared blood. They were loyal allies, trusted colleagues, and fiercely protective friends who valued my intellect and respected my leadership. They were the family I had actively chosen, people who celebrated my victories instead of feeling threatened by them. There were no hidden agendas in this beautiful room, no backhanded compliments, and absolutely no false conditional love. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my rich Cabernet, letting the complex flavors settle on my tongue as I turned back to face the glittering city skyline. I thought about the frightened, marginalized girl I had been, the invisible scapegoat constantly begging for a scrap of validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I thought about my father's ruined pride, my brother's prison cell, and my mother's bitter, lonely exile. They had spent 3 decades throwing heavy, jagged stones of cruelty, manipulation, and profound disrespect at me, hoping to crush my spirit and keep me buried forever. They had desperately wanted me to remain small so they could feel large. But they had fundamentally misunderstood the basic nature of my character. I did not break under the crushing weight of their endless abuse. Instead, I had carefully collected every single stone they threw. I gathered their insults, their rejections, and their betrayals, and I used them to build the impenetrable foundation of my own magnificent life. The scapegoat had finally become the queen, and tonight, looking out over the empire I commanded, I knew I would live peacefully in this beautiful castle forever. Looking back on the ashes of my father's empire and the beautiful life I built from them, the greatest lesson I learned is that your worth is never determined by the people who refuse to see it. For 33 years, I allowed my family to define my identity. I let them convince me that I was a failure, a disappointment, and a burden, simply because I didn't fit into their shallow transactional worldview. But their cruelty was never a reflection of my actual value. It was merely a reflection of their own profound brokenness. If you are currently trapped in a toxic family dynamic, constantly playing the scapegoat while someone else is treated as the untouchable golden child, please listen to me. You do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep your abusers warm. You do not owe your loyalty to people who willingly sacrifice your mental health, your financial security, or your future for their own selfish comfort. True family is not about shared DNA or enduring endless disrespect out of obligation. It is about mutual respect, unconditional support, and choosing to surround yourself with people who celebrate your victories instead of plotting your downfall. I found my true family in the colleagues who stood by me and the friends who believed in my vision when my own parents tried to destroy it. You have the power to walk away, to build your own empire in silence, and to redefine exactly what family means to you. Have you ever had to draw a hard boundary with a toxic family member who constantly underestimated your worth? I would love to hear your experiences in the comments below. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that they are strong enough to walk away. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that you are always the author of your own incredible future.